I'm Dr Becky Appleton, and this presentation in the series will focus on things to consider when interviewing and using interview data as a research tool. Here are some pros and cons to using interviews in your research. This method can be really useful to find out more about how experienced certain procedures or aspects of care. They can explore why things are happening in a research study, for example, why the take-up of an intervention is low. You only need to recruit a smaller number of participants in comparison to a general quantitative research project. However, qualitative research can lack the ability to generate broader conclusions. Instead, they're focused on a more specific population and a specific setting. The interpretation of qualitative data can also be affected by researcher biases. This is why it's really important to keep a reflexive journal or think reflexively about your own biases when conducting qualitative research. It's also really important to involve people with lived experience in your qualitative research. This could be through helping to identify particular topics of interest, to come up with questions that you include in your interview topic guide, or also when analysing the data. This is really important to make sure that your findings and your research as a whole is relevant to the needs of the population of interest. Here are the main steps when conducting qualitative interviews. Firstly, you want to design your topic guide, so decide on the types of questions that you're going to ask people and why. You then need to recruit your participants. This could be by recruiting participants from a particular setting or using online methods such as social media. Then moving on to conduct your interviews. And once you've got all your data, you need to transcribe this to a written form so that it's ready for analysis. The final step in the process is analysing your data, followed by writing up or disseminating your findings. And I'll now go through each of these steps in more detail. The first step is designing your topic guide. Key things to consider are the flow of questions. For example, starting with something more general to help people ease into the interview before getting more specific as the interview goes on. You can also add prompts that you might want to use if a participant either gives a short answer to a question or if they're not really sure what to say. You can give them a prompt which might help them understand the question and lead them to give a more full response. It's important to make sure your questions are open-ended. For example, you really don't want to include questions that can be answered by a simple yes or no. Instead, you want people to talk more about a topic. Therefore, asking questions like, can you tell me a bit more about that? Or how did you experience this inpatient stay? Rather than asking a closed question, for example, did you find your inpatient stay acceptable? It's good practice to aim for around 8 to 12 main questions with some prompts underneath each question. This is particularly if you're aiming on doing an interview that's lasting around 45 minutes to an hour. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to involve people with lived experience in designing your topic guide to ensure that the questions are appropriate and relevant to that patient population. The next step is recruiting participants. This you could aim to recruit from anywhere up to 20 participants, but in general a good number is between 8 to 15, although there isn't a kind of specific answer for what the optimum number of qualitative interviews should be. It's good practice to ensure diversity amongst your participants, both in terms of their socio-demographic characteristics, for example gender or ethnicity, but also around their group or their location. For example, if you're interviewing staff, you might want to make sure that you're interviewing people who have different roles within a team or at different levels of seniority or different professions, for example. This can be done by using an approach called maximum variation or stratified sampling. When thinking about how to recruit participants, certain strategies can include putting up posters, putting information in mailing lists, or giving out leaflets. You can also recruit on social media or LinkedIn. Make sure people are given an information sheet with details of the study. This generally includes information such as why the study is taking place, what the process will be, so how long the interview will be and where it will take place, and also information about data security. You should also ensure that participants give informed consent prior to the interview taking place. Practicalities around conducting the interviews include considering whether they'll take place online, in person, or over the phone. And depending on the setting, how are you actually going to collect this data? If it's in person, do you have a private space that's quiet where you'll be able to record the interview? If it's online, can everybody access Teams and Zoom? Will they have Wi-Fi? And how will you record your interviews? Will you use a project mobile phone, a dictaphone, or the recording function through Teams or Zoom? Once you've got the interview recording, you'll need to transcribe your data for analysis. There's two main ways this is normally done, either through getting a transcription company to transcribe this for you, or using automatic transcription software. This is generally becoming quite good now, so for example through using the automatic transcription function on Microsoft Teams. Whichever approach you choose, it's good practice to do a final check of your transcripts before deleting the original recording. This can make sure that you're identifying any mistakes that either the transcription company or the software may have made when transcribing your data. It's at the transcription stage that you also remove any identifying information. This could be references to particular places or people's names, but it's important to remove this at transcription stage, so then going on, all of your data is completely anonymous. You should also consider data security and where you will store your transcripts. It's good practice to give every transcript an identifier rather than using a person's name, and also secure them somewhere safe where only you or members of your research team will have access. Once you've transcribed your data, you can then move on to data analysis. The exact approach you use might depend on your research question. For example, thematic analysis fits with a research question which is more exploratory. Or if your research question focuses on barriers and facilitators, then using a framework approach might be more appropriate. It's also good practice to involve team members and people with lived experience when analysing your data. You can also think further about practicalities. Do you want to use some coding software, for example NVivo, or would you prefer to do this by hand? And in the picture here you can see an example of qualitative coding using more traditional handwritten approach. Here is a more in-depth example of qualitative coding using coding for a thematic analysis. This is an excerpt from a fictional interview exploring the lived experiences of older adults adapting to life after a major stroke. You can see here that the interviewer has asked quite an open question. Can you tell me how things have changed? And here is one paragraph that the respondent said. Within here you can see there's certain points that I've highlighted, and these represent different things you could code within this paragraph. They start by comparing before and after the stroke, and move on to talk about physical symptoms and how this has impacted their life in terms of needing help with daily activities. They also talk about the emotional impact, saying that it's frustrating. And you can see here that we've given codes to each of these different highlighted points. In thematic analysis, you would do this for all of your transcripts across all of your respondents, and then look at merging these codes to create categories and ultimately themes. And finally, here are a few interview tips. First, pilot the topic guide and make any amendments before you start collecting your data for real. You could do this with members of your PPO group or even just friends and colleagues, but this can be really helpful to, one, ensure that your questions make sense and that people understand what you're asking them, but also check whether your topic guide is too long. Will people be able to answer these questions within the specified interview length? Consider the flow of questions throughout the interview. Sometimes it can be helpful to have something more general at the beginning to get people going, and then asking about more specific or perhaps more sensitive topics later on. Use open-ended questions to get the most amount of data back from your participants, and prepare prompts to use if needed, if you want to find out any extra information or if somebody has given quite a short response to a question. It can be really tempting to talk lots as the interviewer, whereas actually you should try not to talk too much at all. Don't worry if there are silences after questions. This can just mean that a participant's thinking of how best to answer your question. It can also be really helpful to take notes after each interview, which could help guide your data analysis. Here are a couple of references to further information that you might find helpful if you're planning a qualitative study. You can see the direct link on screen to the catalogue hosted on NHS's Learning Hub platform. Registration is free, and if you have an NHS email, you'll have free access to both the Learning Hub as a whole and the WE-R NHS catalogue resources. We have links to podcasts, videos, and journal articles on a range of topics related to education and workforce research. WE-R NHS is on YouTube, and we also have a regular e-newsletter. Thanks very much for watching.